And it did. Curfew notices were posted on the telephone poles. And then after that, about a week or so, the notice for the evacuation.
I didn't think that the government would go as far as to include American citizens to be interned without a hearing. And then later on, they changed my draft card to 4C, which is enemy alien. In those days, if you're an Asian, people automatically think you don't belong in this country. You're not an American. And I thought that was wrong. December 7th, it was Sunday. My girlfriend and I were up on Skyline Boulevard looking down the Bay Area, the cities. At that time, I was going around with a Caucasian girlfriend. And we had spread out the Sunday magazine to just relax, and it had the music on, car radio, Sunday, nice sunny day. And of course, we were talking mush. And, and all of a sudden, it stopped. And they announced that Pearl Harbor was attacked. There'd been so much friction between the United States and Japan, and the way Japan was so active going into China and doing all that, invasion and so forth, that I had a feeling that, they're just crazy enough to come down here. And that's what they did. At the nursery, my parents, they were all around the radio listening. They weren't saying very much. My mother was crying, my father was just disgusted. All that work that my parents did to that nursery and so forth, what's going to happen?
There were a lot of organizations that wanted internment, the agricultural interests in California, for example, because Japanese Americans had been so successful as farmers and competitors.
So when Pearl Harbor hit, now they could say it was, quote, military necessity, and therefore they could wholesalely exclude persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. There were a lot of persons, agricultural persons to media persons, who were whipping up anti-Japanese sentiments.
General DeWitt, who was lieutenant general, is about as high as they get, was the general in charge of the West Coast. There was some feeling that the West Coast might be invaded. He had recommended that the Japanese Americans be excluded from the West Coast so that they couldn't give secret tips to the invaders if the invaders ever came. That was sheer baloney, because there is no instance ever discovered in which any Japanese American on the West Coast ever did anything disloyal. It was pure foolishness.
Colonel Ben Detson, who was a government lawyer, wrote all of the arguments for the internment that General DeWitt presented to the War Department. Ben Detson simply said that because Japanese Americans belonged to an enemy race, their internment could be justified.
You see, before the war, my parents were very proud people. They always talked about Japan, and also about the samurais and stuff like that. And right after Pearl Harbor, everything just, they were just real quiet. They kept it to themselves. They were afraid to talk about that.
The Secret Service and the FBI had swept into the Japanese American community and had arrested any community leader, any teacher, any civic organization head of any importance in that community.
I thought the exclusion order would be only for aliens and those that are born in Japan. I didn't think that the government would go as far as to include American citizens. Well, I knew I couldn't take my girlfriend with me, so I decided maybe we should try to sneak out to Nevada to get away from this. And then one day my girlfriend wanted to meet me. I was waiting for her at the corner, and she didn't show up. I ran out of cigarettes. So, like a darn fool, I went across the street to the drugstore, and someone recognized me, I assumed, because when I came back and I was standing there for another 5 minutes, then the police came. And they looked around and looked at me and said, "Did you see any short Japanese person around here, Asian?" I said, "No." He looked at me and says, "Well, let me see your identification." By that time, the 2 MPs came in the military. And he says, "We have to take you to the city hall." After I was arrested, I never did see my girlfriend again. When the MPs took me to a separate room, well, it was a horse stall, and it was way out on the other side of the racetrack, and they took me there in a pickup. But it was a big door for to let horses in. There's a gap about 12 inches down below. There's no floor, it's just dirt, so the wind was blowing through there, and there's cracks all around the wall, and there was a light bulb up there, one light bulb on the ceiling, and that was it. And I went there and I lied on the cot and I said, "Gee, jail was a lot better than this."
After we got to Topaz, Utah, people realized who Fred was. He felt very lonely there at Topaz. He was working digging ditches. They were building a hospital, and the crew was very cold to him. Some people had this terrible feeling that Fred thought he was different than the rest of us Japanese Americans, and so they sort of shunned him.
I believe in principles. And certainly I believe that all persons, without distinction, are entitled to the support of the Constitution. We tried to find a legal challenge to the internment, but of course, in order to do that, you have to have a test case. You have to find somebody who is willing to have his case carried through the courts up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So we were on the lookout to find a case of that kind. It wasn't easy until I heard of Fred Korematsu's case.
The real significance of Fred's case is that it raised, for the first time, the central issue. Was the internment itself constitutional?
Our case depended on the U.S. Supreme Court. We recognized that at the outset because they would recognize there's no basis legally for this discrimination. It's a denial of due process of law.
It's part of the obligation of attorneys who present cases before the Supreme Court, and supremely so of government attorneys, the Solicitor General, that they have to be candid and honest with the court so that the Supreme Court can decide these matters of public policy on the basis of a well-developed record of all the relevant facts. And one of the tragedies of the Korematsu case was that that didn't happen.
The government had two basic arguments. One was that as a matter of military necessity, that is, the prevention of espionage and sabotage, the evacuation was required. The other was that it was limited to Japanese Americans because their racial characteristics, what one of the government lawyers said, they belong to an enemy race, was a flat-out racist argument.
Race was not really an issue apart from slavery until the Civil War. Then we have the 14th Amendment, which guarantees to every citizen equal protection of the laws. But the court rapidly retreated from that jurisprudence so that by the 1890s, we have a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, which allows separate but equal, right? Separate but equal drinking fountains, separate but equal places on the bus. And that's the state of the law at the time of Korematsu. The country was rife with racial prejudice, and the Constitution did not do much to prevent it.
I think really the Supreme Court deserves to be criticized in these cases. You read the transcripts of the arguments, the justices are not saying, where's the evidence to support General DeWitt's charges? They're simply going along, and I think one reason for that is that some members of the court, I would say Justice Frankfurter in particular, felt that it was their patriotic duty to support the president in this case without regard to the Constitution.
Well, I think the Korematsu case illustrates a number of important things for our society. One is that the courts failed us at an important time and an important juncture, as did a number of our very great leaders, because after all, it was President Roosevelt, who signed the executive order that interned the Japanese in California and throughout the western United States.
Over the years, this branch has handled at least 8 cases in the U.S. Supreme Courts. We lost one case. And the shocking thing is that we lost a case of racial discrimination against Japanese. That's a shocking thing.
I was dumbfounded on what happened. But I continued on. I said, I'm an American, and just as long as I'm in this country, that I'm going to keep on going. And if there is a chance of reopening the case, I will do it.
I met Fred after his Supreme Court case had been decided, and later we married and eventually moved to California to live. When our daughter Karen was, I believe, she's a junior in high school, she came home from one afternoon and said that in her social studies class, her friend Maya had given a report about the Japanese concentration camps, Japanese American concentration camps, and that they mentioned a Korematsu case, and she said, what is this all about? And I said, well, that's your father.
Well, you know, why did you never tell me about this? I mean, why wasn't anything ever talked about my father in this regard? I couldn't believe it. I was really upset. And she said basically that it was something that, it was a subject that my father chose not to discuss.
He was quite aware that he had a criminal record, and he did experience discrimination when he applied for employment.
He felt responsible for the internment in a sort of backhanded way because his case had been lost in the Supreme Court.
He always wanted to reopen his case, but we didn't know how to do that.
The internment of Japanese Americans was a fait accompli. By 1944, people had already lost their property, 110,000 people. Some were now homeless. Some had lost their lives. Their whole structure and community was now broken. At that point, do you admit the wrongdoing and say, we're sorry, or do you cover it up? And in 1944, they chose to cover it up.
It was the opportunity to go back and recreate history, a history that had a personal impact on my family, on a whole population of people, that had a major impact on the civil rights laws.
Korematsu versus the United States was a civil rights disaster. So to be able to reopen that case, to be able to vindicate our families, and to rewrite the books on this was a real opportunity.
What I did not expect to find was literally on the top of the first file a document from one of the Justice Department lawyers to the Solicitor General of the United States saying, we are telling lies to the Supreme Court. We have an obligation to tell the truth to the court.
The lawyers on the legal team were mainly Japanese American and very young lawyers, very idealistic young attorneys. And the question was, if you're going to reopen these monumental Supreme Court cases, do you know what you're doing? And I think there was a sense in the community that these lawyers better not lose Korematsu versus the United States for a second time. The question was, how was the government going to refute these admissions of wrongdoing and cover-up and suppression being made by the government's own lawyers?
I really think they were adrift in the Department of Justice, and this is what we had heard. There were hawks and there were doves. There were people who wanted to just give in to the petition, and there were people who wanted to fight the petition. As a result, they could not come to a coherent position. So, as they are wont to do at times of confusion, they just decided on a strategy of delay.
And after a period of 2 or 3 months with no response, the government then approached lead counsel Dale Minami and said, well, what about a pardon? Do you think Fred Korematsu would accept a pardon?
Well, of course, a pardon has a certain connotation to it, that you did something that was wrong, but your government is willing to forgive you for it.
And we brought it to Fred and Catherine, and her feeling was, it's Fred's position that the government should seek a pardon from him.
I concluded after looking at all of the facts that they had done something tantamount to confessing error. And when the government does in fact come in and confess error, even though they don't say in those magic incantation words, we confess error, they had done substantially the same thing.
We went into the courtroom the next day. The judge outlined the posture of the case. I spoke, Victor Stone spoke, Fred Korematsu spoke, and she rendered her decision then, all in one day.
We knew in advance that there was going to be a fairly large number of people in attendance, and so we did agree to open up the ceremonial courtroom, which is a much larger courtroom, and the place was packed.
A lot of these people had been in the camps. A lot of these people had not seen each other for 40 years. There was a lot of excitement in the courtroom.
Mr. Stone didn't want the court to make any kind of findings of fact, any kind of conclusions about what had happened some 40 years ago. So he pleaded to the court not to make any findings, that this is a case 40 years ago. Let's just let bygones be bygones. You know, these wounds need healing.
And Dale Minami, when he addressed the court, said, well, whose feelings are we talking about? Are we talking about the wounds of Japanese Americans who've already been in prison, who've already suffered the losses, who've already suffered the indignity and the humiliation of being in prison? Or are we talking about the reputations of government authorities who, in essence, lied to the Supreme Court, as demonstrated by the government's own documents?
And after Dale finished, Fred made what I think was a very powerful, very simple, direct appeal. He said, 40 years ago, I came into this courtroom in handcuffs, and I was sent to a camp. He said, the camp was not fit for human habitation. Horse stalls are for horses, not for people.
And then went on to entreat the court to overturn his conviction, saying that what happened to him could happen to any American citizen who looks different or who comes from a different country, and that it was important for this court to understand that the relief given to him was not just for him personally, but for, in a sense, the benefit of the whole country.
And as soon as he'd ended, and as soon as the argument was over, Judge Patel made her ruling right from the bench.
I decided beforehand that the people had come for a reason, and they deserved some kind of a response from the court.
And she issued her ruling, in essence stating that there was sufficient evidence of governmental misconduct, of suppression of evidence, and that the policies of the American government were infected with racism.
And when she finished and just got up and left, walked out of the courtroom, the audience literally was stunned.
I turned to Fred, and Fred looked at me and said, what happened? And I said, Fred, you won. Your conviction's thrown out, you won. And Fred looked at me in a very subdued way. I think he was a little stunned, and he said, that's good. That's really good.
and I just couldn't believe it. It took me quite a while before I actually sunk in that I have won.
We understood when we first took this case that by attacking the conviction under the vehicle we were using, we could not overturn the actual Supreme Court ruling that was rendered in 1944. That was our greatest hope, but we could not find legal vehicle to do so. So the Supreme Court precedent still stands as a legal precedent.
The principle that you can single out people on the basis of their race, their ancestry, I think is the principle that is so dangerous, so subversive to our Constitution.
It may help some people to go, wait a minute, what's going on in America right now? Are we inadvertently and in an unconscious way perpetrating a similar abuse against another group?
There was discussion that if any American prisoners were taken in the war, in Desert Storm, that there would be a roundup of Iraqis as a trade-off of POWs.
2 years ago, I spoke at the University of Michigan, and we were going through there with the group of us, and all of a sudden, there was another group. Students came from the other end, about 15 of them, and they surrounded me and said, Fred, we appreciate what you've been doing. And they gave me a certificate, and it was the Arab students of Michigan.
Today, Fred Korematsu is seen as a hero, as he should be.
Fred was the ordinary person who at a time of great crisis rises to extraordinary heights.
Fred reminded me very much of somebody else, and that's Rosa Parks, the woman who refused to sit in the back of a bus in Birmingham, Alabama. And it's ordinary people like that just making a stand. And it's usually something very simple, like going to work. Fred wanted to stay in his home. That's all he wanted to do. And it's the right that every American has. But it's that kind of person, ordinary people who do extraordinary things, that really shape our history.
In the long history of our country's constant search for justice, some names of ordinary citizens stand for millions of souls. Plessy, Brown, Parks. To that distinguished list, today we add the name of Fred Korematsu.